Hi and welcome to the Black and White Special Seminar. Now, I've been preparing some learning resources for Adobe's Lightroom Academy, and I've put a link there. Now, you don't need to take notes during this seminar because I am going to make available the slide deck for this presentation, and you'll find lots of links there you can click on. Now, if you're in the Lightroom CC application, this is available for your mobile devices, but it's also available for the desktop. And this Lightroom Academy is very much linked in with this Learn and Discover features on the CC version, not the Classic but the CC version. You can see how other people have edited their images, and some photographers invite you to re-edit or remix their image. So it's a great resource for learning how to convert images to black and white, and there's a whole section devoted to black and white. So without much further ado, let's get started. Color photography only really arrived in the 1930s, so before that date photography was a black and white medium only. And for many students of photography going back 15 or 20 years or so, again their first experience was with black and white film and black and white darkrooms. Color chemicals and color film, even if it was around, was difficult to manage and difficult to use. So for many artists, when you were at college, black and white was the medium because of the level of control we could exercise over the medium. And black and white is still the medium of choice for many photographers. Obviously, with the digital age, most people's exposure is to color first, but we're going to be looking at photography as a black and white medium. In fact, the word photography is from two Greek words for light and writing, and so we are going to be looking at the light in this seminar. To better understand the medium, we have to start learning to notice the light. It is quite often that we're so wrapped up in looking at the subject that we fail to recognize where the light is falling. And because light is the medium for black and white, we have to start training our eyes to see where the light is falling. And we also then have to take that next step forward. We have to learn to pre-visualize what we would like that final black and white outcome to be, because it's not just about the capture stage, it's about the capture and the post-production. Dodging and burning, the traditional ways of lightening and darkening tones in a darkroom, are really the key tools that we have to create our own narrative or story when we're working with the black and white medium. If we look at the quality of the light, and this is something that we need to learn how to describe, is we can start looking at whether shadows have clearly defined edges. Now, the sunlight creates this harsh light source that creates very definite shadows. Obviously, with the absence of cloud cover, it does have that great ability to cast long shadows, especially if we're working in the early or late hours of the day. But of course, we often find that there is detail in those shadows, and that is because of the secondary fill lighting, which is the skylight. And so being able to describe light in terms of the distribution of the shadows and whether the shadows are clearly defined or not are the ways that we can start recognizing the light in our scenes. Now, the direction of the light is one of our key tools here. Now, we are able to move in relation to the light source, the sunlight, and so we can decide what direction the shadows will move in order to create the perfect composition. This particular image is a little bit tricky to work out because we've got the reflected light from the sunlight as well, casting a secondary set of shadows into the scene. To make great black and white photos, you have to start thinking in black and white. And what I mean by that is you have to try and work out what sorts of images will lend themselves to being converted from color to black and white. Take this example of my father, for instance. I was going through his old portraits of him as a boy and a young man, and on his 90th birthday I wanted to create a portrait of him showing the man he is now. But of course, the only way that this portrait, this modern day portrait, can speak to the images of him as a young man and as a boy, is if all three are in black and white. And as soon as I decided that that was the medium I was going to use, then of course I start using appropriate lighting. And so this is just a directional window light, creating that beautiful modeling and emphasizing the age of my father on his 90th birthday. So that's what I mean by starting to think in black and white. This image was captured in Hiroshima and was part of a series of images documenting the location or hypocenter of the detonation of the atomic bomb in 1945, and also I was photographing in the nearby Peace Park. Using black and white to convey this narrative was in keeping with the somber nature of this location. And here you can see a group of images that form this visual narrative. Now, I would never dream of mixing colour and black and white in the same narrative. It's something that you really need to decide from the outset whether the photo story is going to be better conveyed in colour or black and white. This image serves to document demonstrations by Indigenous Australians about deaths in custody. The use of black and white instead of colour provides the images with more gravitas or weight to the seriousness of the communication. It's sort of the type of image that we might expect to see in a newspaper or magazine documenting these types of issues. In some instances, a black and white conversion can restore drama to a scene where the flat midday lighting could result in an otherwise uninteresting colour image. I captured this image in Alaska, and unfortunately I didn't have the time to pick the early or late part of the day where the light source would be low in the sky. But there is enough colour information in here where I can separate the hero of the subject, the boathouse there, away from the distant forest and the mountains above. So this is a great tool where we can instill a great deal more drama in a scene by converting the image to black and white rather than leaving the flat, uninteresting colours. When working in mixed lighting, such as this image of the Sumo stable, in this instance I've got a mixture of fluorescent and daylight with different colour temperatures. Converting this series of images to black and white helps focus the attention on the light rather than the problematic colours. And as you can see from this particular image, that skylight just above these sumo wrestlers is providing that useful dramatic rim lighting that helps to give the shape to the form. We probably won't notice the sweaty bodies without converting these type of images to the black and white format. Now, as I go through this black and white seminar, I'll be presenting you with tasks that you can do on your own. One of the useful things for a photographer is to acquire the language that we can use to describe our photos. This helps when selling the images to clients, or just visually describing the images and describing maybe to our friends or colleagues why we've decided to convert images to black and white. So I'm inviting you here to describe these images in terms of highlights, midtones and shadows, and see if you can work out where the light source is coming from and how you would describe the quality and direction of the light. Is it a soft, even light source, or is it a directional, harsher light source? Okay, and in the second on your own activity, I want you to go search through your own Lightroom catalog and find at least 3 images or series of images that you think will look better in black and white rather than in color. And what reasons would you give for someone for making this choice? I'm describing some of the reasons I've decided to convert series of images to black and white. Now I'm setting you the task to help describe maybe to a friend or a colleague why you've chosen the black and white format for your images. Okay, photographing in black and white. To help us focus on light when framing our image, there are several tools we can use to help us think about that final black and white image that we want to create, rather than the colourful image that's right in front of our camera. Fortunately for us, most mirrorless cameras and smartphones allow us to view the scene as a black and white image. Obviously this is not the case for DSLRs, but if you've got a smartphone, for instance my iPhone allows me to select mono or noir, which is a high contrast version of mono. You can also use the CC app on your smartphone to capture directly into the black and white medium. Now, obviously, if you're using that CC app, you've got a couple of choices there. You've got high contrast black and white or flat black and white. I typically favor the high contrast black and white for my own black and white work. And of course, with our alpha cameras, we have the option of going into the creative styles, or on the newer menus, the creative looks, and choosing black and white. And we can also ramp up the contrast. Now, if you're capturing in the raw file format, we are able to recover the color information later, but just by previewing the scene in black and white will help us focus our attention on the light shape and form and texture of the scene, and color will no longer be a distraction as we're photographing. Okay, so that's also possible on most smartphones now, especially going through the CC app. We can choose to capture in the raw file format, and of course every time we're capturing in the raw file format, the color or the crop can be restored later if we change our mind. The famous photographer Ansel Adams coined this term pre-visualization, and this is the ability to stop looking at the scene in the actual tonality that we're looking at and start imagining the final crafted version after we've taken it through either a darkroom or, in our case, the Lightroom. One of the important final steps of pre-visualization is to also imagine the post-production editing that we're going to use, i.e. imagining darkening the blue skies or throwing a pool of light over the hero focal point. Now, this ability to darken and lighten tones in post-production predates Photoshop and Lightroom. It's what the photographers were doing in the dark rooms a long time before Photoshop was ever invented, and these terms of darkening and lightening are often referred to as dodging, which is to lighten, and burning, which is to darken individual tones. And I'm going to be showcasing you some of the tools on offer inside of Lightroom that we can do this. Here I've got an example of standing in front of a colorful scene, but choosing to go into the creative styles or creative looks on the alpha camera and choosing black and white. And again, if I ramp up the contrast, this helps me to pre-visualize the final scene. And as you can see with this particular scene, I'm going at a time of day where the lighting is not flat and even. We've got that directional light source, and by choosing my vantage point and choosing the direction I'm photographing in, I've got that shaping effect that the light is casting. Obviously it's coming in from the right side, casting those beautiful shadows on the far side of those sand dunes there. Now, of course, with exposure compensation, it is important to watch the tones. We do want to make sure that we're preserving all of the detail in those brightest highlights. Now, when you are faced with a scene where the dominant tones are darker than average, there is a tendency for the cameras to overexpose, and the highlights are then at risk of clipping or overexposing. So just beware of that. You will need to do a negative exposure compensation on the exposure compensation dial if we are photographing something where the dominant tones are darker than average. And as soon as we do that negative exposure compensation, we're going to make sure that we're protecting those brightest highlights. The opposite of true, of course, is of scenes where the dominant tones are lighter than average. Now, there is less of a risk of clipping tones in these instances, but you will find yourself underexposing in these snowy scenes where the dominant tones are lighter than average. You will find that if you're getting the best possible exposure, you'll be raising the exposure compensation dial to counteract for that underexposure that the camera will feel obliged to do. And of course, if you've been watching my workflows, you'll know that I use zebras rather than the histogram to guide me as to where those highlights are sitting as a raw shooter. So I will typically set a custom zebra setting for 109 plus lower limit. And so when I see those zebras, I know that there's a risk of losing those brightest highlight tones. The optimum exposure, of course, is always exposing to the right, exposing as much as we can, raising the exposure as much as we can, but before we start clipping those highlight tones. And that's given rise to the acronym which is exposed to the right, which is ETTR. So if you encounter that acronym, you'll know what the photographers are doing. They're raising the exposure until just below the point where the highlights start clipping or overexposing. So in this image on the left, you'll see I've raised the exposure as much as I dare before I actually lose those brightest highlights on Half Dome in Yosemite there. So so here we are. So we're one of the things that you can probably also remember is expose for the highlights and then process for the shadows. So make sure you're retaining all of the detail in the highlights, and then make sure that we're lifting out some of those shadows so we can see the rich detail there as well. Okay, so one of the things that you might also consider in the capture stage when we're capturing images for black and white conversion is also the aspect ratio. We are able to change the aspect ratio that we're shooting in. Now 3:2 is the native aspect ratio of the sensor, but we're not restricted to previewing the scene in that aspect ratio. We can choose, for instance, the 16:9 aspect ratio, which will go full frame on a monitor or a TV. Now again, if you're photographing in the raw file format, you're going to be able to recover what is outside of that crop area if we're cropping tighter or changing the shape of the aspect ratio. So one of the aspect ratios you might want to consider when working in black and white is the traditional square format. Now the analog cameras, the medium format analog cameras, were often a square format. Thinking about cameras such as the Hasselblad and the Rolleiflex, these were square format, and so it is worth considering if your scene doesn't suit the 3:2 aspect ratio. Just start framing the image as a square image in camera. Sometimes this helps you create the balance of the shape and form by actually cropping in camera. And remember, raw shooters, you can recover what is outside of that square format later. Another popular format of the old black and white masters was the 5:4 aspect ratio. Their field cameras were a 5:4 or 8:10, which is the same shape as 5:4. And so if you're going for that vertical composition, sometimes rather than going for the narrower 3:2 aspect ratio, you can go for the classic 5:4 aspect ratio. Now of course the classic print format for black and white is the traditional 8:10, and again that fits that 5:4 aspect ratio. One of my favorite aspect ratios now, of course, is the 16:9, just simply because if you are cropping down 16:9, you are going to go full screen on a computer monitor or a TV screen. Another narrower and wider format to go for is 2:1. Now if you are creating a folio book, if you go for a square folio book, that double page spread going across the seam there will be 2:1. So that is something certainly worth considering. It also gives you that cinematic widescreen feel to some of the images that you might be preparing. Now when you are cropping images in Lightroom, there are a series of overlays that you can use to help create the perfect composition. Now you may have heard of rule of thirds. We can often in camera get a grid laid over our image as we compose the image in camera, but we don't have access to some of the other useful overlays. Like for this one is actually the golden ratio. As you can see, those segments inside of that grid are not in exact third increments. The golden ratio actually predates the rule of thirds, and you can see in this framing of this vertical portrait here, I put the intersection lines of that golden ratio lining up with the pupils in the eyes. So this is creating a really perfect symmetrical and balanced composition. Of course, the rule of thirds is something that is also available. You can just simply keep on pressing the O key to cycle through the different overlays that you might want to use. And here I'm lining up the horizon line on the upper line of that rule of thirds. If you have an important vertical in your composition, you might also put that on the intersection of a vertical and horizontal line of that rule of thirds. Now here's another on your own task that I'm setting you here, and that is to choose a sunny day where you're going to get some shadows, and I would like you to go out to the same location at dawn, midday and sunset, and try and incorporate both the sunlit areas but also the shadows in your composition. I remember when I was photographing this particular image, for instance, so when the guy came up to the camera, he was quite curious as to what I was photographing, and I actually had to point out the shadow before he could actually see the shadow of the tree being cast up the wall. Remember me saying, you know, sometimes we forget to see the light. So what I'm setting you the task is to go out and look for the shadows, look for the light, and make that a big hero of the compositions that you're photographing. And I want you then to compare the quality of the lighting effect and the mood of the images you've captured, and try to capture at least some images that use long shadows as an essential component of the design, as is the case of this particular image that you're looking at now. Essentials in black and white. This is where we're going to go into the editing or the post-production work inside of Lightroom. Now I'm very much thinking that photography is a holistic process. It's that pre-visualization, it's the capture, but it also includes the post-production editing. There are some photographers that wear straight out of camera SOOC as a badge of honor, but I think given that my camera doesn't see the way I see it certainly doesn't feel anything about what I'm capturing, the post-production editing is a really important component of what we're doing. Now there are several different ways we can convert a color image in Lightroom CC to black and white. The method that gives you the least amount of control over the outcome is simply just to lower the saturation slider to 0. Why this is not such a good idea is that you will then have no control how the individual colors translate into black and white, whether blues record as light tones or dark tones. By selecting the black and white option in the color panel, we can use the black and white mixer controls to make individual colors lighter or darker. In this way we can isolate or highlight the focal point of the image that we want the viewer to notice. You can see in the image above how the arch above the freeway is isolated from the surrounding blue sky, which has been rendered much darker using the luminance slider for the blues in the black and white mixer. So you can quite quickly see how we can tell different narratives or direct the viewer's attention to a different part of the image by careful control over the black and white conversion. This particular slide is showing you now, as I've converted to black and white, I'm going into the black and white mixer. Have a look at for the icon, which I've drawn a red box around there. This is the on image tool inside of Lightroom CC. If you click on it, then you can either click and drag inside of the image preview, or actually if you're on a tablet or a phone, you can tap and drag left or right to darken or lighten a specific color. Basically when you're tapping over an area of the image, it knows what colors is behind the black and white conversion, so it allows you to change the tonality of that color in the image. And if you have a color sitting perhaps between blue and cyan, it will move basically both sliders to darken both of those aspects of the color there. One of the things that you should look for, and again if you look at the bottom right hand corner of this slide, you'll see the icon for the profile browser. Now the standard profile is just Adobe Color, but we don't have to use that as the starting image or profile when we're making a conversion. So what I'm inviting you to do is to click on that profile browser. You'll see 12 numbered profiles, but you'll also see some color filters filter profiles. Now these hark back to the days of black and white analog photography, where, as strange as it may seem, black and white photographers carried color filters. And the reason for this is you could selectively darken or lighten colors in camera, basically on the black and white film. We don't have to do that anymore with digital files, but we're basically applying those color filters in post-production to have exactly the same effect that we used to do by putting colored filters in front of the lens when using black and white film. Now the rule of thumb here is if you're using a color filter, it will lighten similar colors and darken colors that are on the opposite side of the color wheel. So for instance, an orange or red filter will dramatically darken blue skies, and this obviously is used to great effect in black and white landscape photography. Now if you click on a profile, also look for the amount slider. We can increase or decrease the strength of that filter just by dragging to the left or the right. So if you want an even more dramatic sky than just clicking on the red filter black and white profile, you can drag the amount slider to the right. In this example, I've got the color image on the top left with no black and white filter applied, but then I'm going through all of the 5 color filters. Now if you look at the image in the top center, I'm using a blue filter here. You'll notice it darkens, it gives more detail in the skin textures, which can be useful for character portraits. It's also lightening the blue clothing that the young woman is wearing. In contrast to this, if we go down to the bottom right hand where we're using the red filter, now we're lightening the skin tones, basically the warm skin tones, and we're darkening the opposites, which in this case we're darkening the blue clothing. So again, you can see how we can use these color filters to separate or isolate colors and get the right amount of tonal information in the colors that we're using. Once you've applied the black and white profile, if you're fairly new to the Lightroom's controls, I would always invite anyone just to click on the auto option. In this case, I've clicked on the auto option. It's detected some overly bright tones there. The highlights are right up to the edge of the histogram, but clicking on the auto option, it's brought those highlights down so we can see more detail. Now if you know what you want, you've already pre-visualized and you know what sliders are going to get you there, you will probably deep dive straight into the highlights, shadows, black, whites and exposure sliders. One of the things that it's worth noting is when we're working with black and white, contrast and clarity can be applied in much greater amounts than color images will typically support. For instance, you're not often going to be able to get away with adding 100 contrast and 50 clarity to a color image. But if you look at this black and white image, after I've applied the profile and then gone into contrast and clarity, you'll see that the image on the right certainly is a lot more dramatic and benefiting from the increased contrast and clarity. One of the other useful tools, and it's quite a simple and quick tool to use, is a vignette. Now I would invite anyone just to look at what a darkening vignette would do to your particular image. I do notice in a lot of black and white images they're a very common addition. If you have a look at the image on the left with no vignette, basically the eye can sort of spread over the even tones of the background. But as we start applying a vignette, a more subtle vignette to the center image, basically it draws the eye into the central portion of the image. It has a tunneling effect where the eye doesn't get hooked on looking at the edges of the image. We're basically drawn in towards the light. We can apply ever increasing amounts to the post crop vignette. Here on the one on the right I've got a -40. Now that is a very generous amount, and just be careful when you're using these very aggressive vignettes. The smaller the images presented on screen, the more noticeable the vignettes will become. Again, another example of this use of a vignette. Quite clearly now you can see the darkening effect to the edges of the image, and we're quickly drawn into the hero of the image, which is that guy walking across this boardwalk in Japan. So just be careful. The vignette should really only be noticeable to someone when you actually disable it. It shouldn't be so strong that it's immediately obvious that there's a vignette at play here. So one of the things I'm going to do now is set you the task to choose images from your own Lightroom library or photo album that have a variety of different vibrant colors, and then browse the Lightroom profiles and try applying those different color filters. Use the numbered filters as well, but I really would like you to understand how applying a colored filter will darken the opposite colors on the color wheel, and I've provided you with this graphic so you can see the color wheel there, and you can see what colors will be lightened and darkened when you're applying these filters. Okay, so this image that I'm demonstrating here can be remixed, so you can try working with the different color filters on this precise image. Okay, so and another one of the things is just to go through Adobe's Discovery channel to locate images, especially in the black and white genre where vignettes have been applied. Try and guess whether the vignette has been applied, and then just check on the steps just to see how much of a vignette has been applied. You'll notice in the image on the right side there where that vignette is perhaps a little bit too aggressive. It's yes, it does draw the eye into the end of that pier there, but it is probably a little bit aggressive in both in the top left sky and also the bottom of that image. But again, you'll find that the vignettes can be used to very good effect for tunneling the person into the focal point of your image. Let's go on to some of the advanced tools when we're editing in black and white now. Okay, so mastering the craft of black and white photography requires a good understanding of the tools that we have available in Lightroom. These tools include the sliders in the light panel, the tone curve, and the histogram, which is a graphical representation of the tones in our image. Most black and white images benefit from a histogram where the darkest tones touch the left side of the histogram and the brightest tones that also touch the right side of the histogram. We're basically going to be expanding the dynamic range. Now, you'll often find that if we're photographing with long telephoto lenses and the subject is a long way from the lens, that we don't actually have a black point in that image, and we might need to push the darker tones towards the left side of that histogram. Now, if the tones are pushed too far, we can experience a loss of detail in the darkest or lightest of tones. Loss of detail is referred to as clipping, and this is indicated by one or both triangles above the histogram turning white. Now, when we're working in color, you will notice sometimes that they turn a color before turning completely white. That's where one of the three channels or two of the three channels, color channels, starts losing information. But when we've done this black and white conversion, we're seriously only interested in losing textural detail in the highlights or shadows. So it'll just be white or basically a black triangle above the either the top of the left or top of the right of the histogram. Now, if you click on one of these triangles or touch on the triangle if you're on a mobile device, you'll see where there is a loss of detail occurring in the image. The overall brightness of the image is controlled by adjusting the exposure slider. We don't have a brightness slider as such, so just if you're thinking brightness, think exposure slider. In some instances, we may want to increase detail in the shadows by dragging the shadow sliders to the right, and if we're struggling to see rich detail in the highlights, then we'll drag the highlight slider to the left. These are the last adjustments with shadows and highlights. They're very subjective adjustments. There's no right or wrong here, and I would encourage you to be bold when moving these sliders. Now, one of the things that you can do when setting a white point and a black point for your image is to go into threshold view. Now, if you're working on the desktop version of CC, you're going to be holding down the Alt Option key as you drag the slider to the right or to the left. Now, if you're working on a mobile device such as a tablet, you'll find that if you put two fingers and drag the slider with two fingers, you'll go into threshold view. Now, initially, when you're setting the whites, the whole image might appear black. It's only when you start dragging to the right that you'll see the highlight tones that are clipping appearing. Now, we don't actually want to see pretty much any of these highlight tones where you want to see texture and detail. So if you get to this point, you really want to be going backwards on that white slider back towards the center to restore detail in those brightest highlights. Of course, there are some highlights that you actually don't want to have detail in. These are often referred to as specular highlights. They're basically the light source or the reflection of the light source in the image. So in the image on the right here, you'll see the two street lamps there are basically got that red center. That's the source of the light coming from those street lamps. And you've also got a strip light on one of the overpasses there. Now we wouldn't expect to see detail here, so just allow those specular highlights to clip. You'll also see these specular highlights if it's reflected off maybe a lake or off a shiny surface such as metal. So just to be warning, you might see your white highlight clipping triangle light up, but if you go into that threshold view, you'll be reassured to know that that is not going to be an area of interest where you're going to be losing detail that is valuable to you. And again, when we're looking out maybe a window from interior, you wouldn't really expect in most instances to be able to see detail on the outside of that window. We're more concerned about getting rich detail in the shadows. You'll just see on the top of the man's arm gripping the seat there, just starting to lose detail in the highlights on the arm, and that is an area I'd probably want to move the white slider to the left to try and restore detail in the highlight on the skin there, but perhaps not on the window itself. Once you've set the whites, you'll probably move over to the blacks. And again, the same thing is what you're doing here is if you go into that threshold view by holding down the Alt Option key or using two fingers if you're on a tablet or a phone, you're going to go into that threshold view. Now, Ansel Adams, the famous black and white photographer, he really set the ground rules for working in black and white. It's a system he called the zone system, and he always believed that shadows held more visual weight if they did have texture or detail. He only believed that we should clip a shadow tone if there was an absence of a surface, such as the entrance of a cave. You wouldn't really expect to see any detail because there's no surface there. So the absence of the surface would you'd expect to see the clipping again. Remember just clicking on those white triangles if you want to see where we're losing detail. So we're losing both shadow and highlight detail here. So, and you can see the histogram starting to climb up the wall on both sides there, which is another indication that we're losing valuable detail in both the shadows and highlights. So there would be some work to do here. After setting the white optimum white and black points, and we've optimized the dynamic range of our black and white conversion, you'll probably want to go straight over to the shadows and highlights. Now this is where, as I said, there's no rights and wrongs here. You're just going to basically say, you know, how much detail do I actually want to see in those shadows? And just remember Ansel Adams saying that they hold more visual weight if we can actually see a little bit of texture there, if there's a surface there. So in the image on the left, the dark shadow tones are getting really quite dark, and we're struggling to see, even on a bright monitor, we're struggling to see the detail in there. So as we raise that shadows to the right, we're going to see much more details there. We're also by lowering the highlights, we're pulling information into the blue sky, which is on the window at the top of the stairs here. Now you can see that there's There's actually two light sources at play here. It's actually quite a confusing light to try and decipher here. We've got the sun, which is just beyond that window or doorway at the top of the stairs, but we've also got the reflected sunlight off a window behind me, and that's causing two sets of shadows on the guy who's descending the stairs here. And because I really want to see much more information in the sky at the top of the doorway and also the shadows, I'm opening up the shadows to +75 and lowering the highlights to -50, so we're getting to see much more detail. You'll also see there's a second figure at the top of the stairs, which is very hard to pick on the image on the extreme left. Okay, another one that you may want to go and visit is the tone curve. Now, I don't recommend that this is the first point of contact we're trying to adjust tonality. Some of you may think that the tone curve is the best tool for adjusting shadows and highlights. You may have read that somewhere, but actually it's quite a difficult tool to use well. We don't have the full controls of the tone curve that we would have in a program like Photoshop, where we can mask some of the effects of the tone curve over certain areas of the range of tones that we have. So you do want to be a little bit cautious about when you need to do this. I might come into this tool if I've dragged the highlights all the way down to -100, and I just need to leverage a little bit more control and to get a little bit more detail into those highlight tones. And you can see here I'm using what's called the parametric curve, and I'm pulling those highlight tones down. Now the parametric curve is just a little bit more user friendly to people who are new to the tone curve rather than the point curve. The point curve does require a little bit more learning before you can use that well. What happens with the parametric curve, it tries to restrict your adjustment just to the neighboring tones and tries to leave in this case the midtones and shadows alone. Now, if you start clicking on the on image tool, and we saw that on image tool before when we were darkening the blue tones. If you click on that on image tool and then move over your image, you're actually going to see where on that line the tones appear. So as I move over the shadow of the darker tones of the strap this guy is working, you can see the position, and you can also see the histogram below that. A diagonal line that goes from the bottom left to the top right of this grid here. So you can quite clearly see the shadow tones that are on the left, and if we then move our on image tool over to the highlight tones of the face paint that this guy is wearing, you can see where on the histogram those sit. So this might guide you as to, if you're wanting more detail in the highlights, where to start clicking and pulling down on the curve in order to get more detail. So this is where we go into the point curve, and this is really where you're often going to have to anchor certain points. If I just target the shadows and drag that up, it's going to affect the midtones and highlights. And if I'm trying to preserve a little bit of detail in the brightest of highlights of the white silk kimono and the flower that she's got in between her lips there, I'm going to put an additional point and drag that down to try and restore a little bit of those highlights so they don't get too bright and we start losing information in those tones. Now, one of the things that you can do if you're in the point curve is you can seriously wreck your image. You can always reset it, of course, but just wanted to highlight some of the a couple of problem curves. The curve on the left, you can see the curve is touching the top and also touching the bottom. So where you see a curve that is basically running along the floor of that grid or along the ceiling of the grid, you're going to be clipping information. All of those tones on that area of the histogram will be clipped to white or clipped to absolute black. So you might like the graphic representation, but it certainly wouldn't be a black and white conversion in the mold of an Ansel Adams black and white print, which would have rich detail throughout the spectrum except for the specular highlights. On the histogram and tone curve on the right, you can see what's called a cross curve. Now it's important to get a smooth transition of tones as we go from shadows to highlights. What is happening here is some of the shadow tones are brighter than some of the midtones, and so you get this posterization effect, some stepping or banding of tone. And so we're often trying to avoid very steep areas on a curve or very flat plateau areas where that banding or posterization can occur. So one of the other controls, if you are going to use the parametric curve, if you're new to curves, as well as clicking on an area of that curve, you've also got three basic pins underneath the grid there. And if you try to just restrict the adjustment to a specific range of dark tones, you could drag the pin on the left to the left side, and this will help restrict the adjustment just to the darkest tones. And likewise, if we drag if we put a point on the highlights, we could move that pin on the extreme right over to the extreme right of underneath that histogram to restrict tones just to the brightest tones. Okay, so after applying any adjustments using the tone curve, I would always go in and go into that light panel and fine-tune the contrast, clarity and texture, and then maybe finish this conversion up with a possible vignette. Let's get into some of the localized editing tools now, and this has been revamped very recently with these new or masking interface. So in the masking area, when we click on the add a mask, we can choose a tool, whether it's a gradient, a linear gradient, a radial gradient, or a brush. We also have some AI tools, artificial intelligence, which can help isolate the subject, and we can then go on and invert that and basically start adjusting just the background. And I'll move on to those, but we'll look at the brush tool first. This is where we're going to selectively darken or lighten just by painting over an area of the image. So if you click on the add icon and then select the adjustment brush, you can start painting over. You'll get a masking color to show you where you've been painting. When you're painting with the adjustment brush, you're not restricted to just using one slider. So if you're trying to maybe lighten an area of the image like I'm trying to do here, the man's peak cap has created quite a dark shadow over his eyes. So I've got into the adjustment brush. Now you might target the shadows, but equally you might go straight in with exposure or a little bit of both. So you can go in and just fine tune the tonality in just that area. And just remember, if at the bottom of this panel that I'm showcasing here, you can switch the mask on and off. If you hover your cursor over the adjustment brush, you will be shown where that mask is occurring. You can also change the color of the mask if red doesn't suit what you want to be looking at. Now in most instances, when we're dodging and burning, we're making things lighter or darker to reveal more tone. That is the focus of what we're trying to do. We're trying to make the viewer more aware of textural detail in those areas, but there are exceptions to the rule. And when I was going through the Lightroom CC, I was looking at the other people's black and white conversions through that discovery area of the Lightroom CC. I noticed a couple of images where people were painting with exposure to remove information. Basically, if you could look at that image on the left, there's a lot of distracting elements, and this photographer has managed just to pull your attention just to the two people walking away from the camera on the extreme left by completely blowing out the exposure in these open doorways here, and that's been used to great effect, I think, in this particular image. One of the other tools that that is a very popular tool for photographers, and you can buy filters that do this that you put in front of the lens, but we can do this in post-production as well. And these are the linear gradients. So as we go in and we choose a linear gradient, they're most often applied to darken the top of the image where typically you would find the sky appearing, and you could do maybe a -1 or -1.5 or even a -2 exposure decrease to darken a bright sky that is just too distracting in an image area. If you are trying to keep the linear gradient absolutely horizontal, you can hold down the shift key if you're on the desktop version of the app as you drag that over. Now I typically would drag quite a long graduated filter, otherwise the adjustment that you would then apply is going to be a little bit too noticeable if your graduated filter or linear gradient is a little bit too short. I'm also a big fan of dragging these linear gradients from the bottom of my image up towards the center, and what this does is it tends to lead the viewer's eye over the foreground and then starts them on the journey following the leading lines across the top of the sand dunes that you can see here. So I will often use these linear gradients as almost bookends of darkening, where we darken both the top and the bottom of the image and then guide people through the image. And sometimes these can be used in preference to vignettes that we were using previously, just to tunnel people's attention in towards the hero in the center of the image. One of the things that you can do is you might want to darken the majority of the tones, but leave some tones immune from the linear gradient or the darkening effects of the linear gradient. So you can subtract, and you can subtract by color or luminance range. And because this is a black and white, we're going to choose luminance range. When you've chosen the subtract luminance range option, you're basically going to click and drag over an area of the tones that you want to exclude from this, and this will help protect those brighter tones of those clouds. I'll just go back to that slide. You'll also find that once you've selected some tones to exclude from that darkening linear gradient, you will have the bar which you can fine tune. Now there are two areas that you can click and drag to fine tune which areas are excluded from the darkening linear gradient there. So just explore, and you'll probably quickly acquire some skills as to how to use the linear gradients to absolutely the best possible effect. Another one of my favorite tools is the radial gradients, and this is because we can just shine a little bit more light on an area of the image that's perhaps where the shadows are just a little bit dark. This might be faster than actually painting with an adjustment brush. If you see on the image on the left, we've got some nice rim light here, but the guy's face is just a little bit dark. So I've gone and selected a radial gradient plus half a stop, and then just dragged that radial gradient over his face there. Now you can twist and angle these ellipses if you wanted at a slight angle, if that is going to give you the best possible outcome. Now one of the things you can do also when you've dragged these radial gradients is you can subtract or you can add to keep on adding to the adjustment. Here I've dragged a radial gradient just to lighten the hills on the extreme left of the image, but then without creating a new mask, I've just decided to add to the existing mask by lightening the road, which is going to be a hero part of the navigation of the viewer's attention as it goes up towards the lone tree in that middle distance there. One of the things that you might find when you're dragging these radial gradients is a little bit of the light that you're adding might spill into the background, and this becomes a little bit noticeable. You then want to subtract, and again use the subtract brush, and then just paint away any of the areas where you don't want that radial gradient. Now I did talk about maybe inverting some of these masks that we create. So what I've been doing on the previous radial gradients is just adding light to the center of the radial gradient. But in this instance I want to create an off-center vignette because we don't have a completely central hero to this image. So I've dragged a very large radial gradient here, and then I've clicked the invert option, and then I'm darkening everything surrounding this boathouse here. This helps create that asymmetrical sort of vignette, which is a better outcome in this particular image. So one of the new AI tools, which is a great addition to the newer versions of Lightroom, is the ability to select the sky. So rather than just maybe dragging a linear gradient over the sky, I can just hit select sky and then roll down the exposure, and that will evenly darken that overly bright sky that we've got there. One of my big fans with the new A tools is the select subject, but often I don't want to edit the subject, I want to edit everything except the subject. So in this case what I'm doing is I've selected subject, which it quite clearly defines the guy with the spray can as the subject. I then invert the subject, and then I can go in and maybe darken the area around the subject, or lower the whites, or maybe even lower the sharpening, just to create a bit more figure ground separation, which is what I'm doing in this particular image, in order to make that figure really pop from that background there. So this is a short little activity I'm setting you now, and that's to go onto the Discovery channel and find images where the photographers use the masking options to exclude details from the final composition, giving you a couple of links here that you can click on, where quite clearly you can see the final outcomes are very different to the original images, cleaning up any distracting elements from the composition in both instances here. And then perhaps a more useful exercise is to identify one of the images in your own folio, and then apply graduated or linear and radial filters plus the adjustment brush to redistribute highlights and shadows within the image, and then see if you can describe how the editing has altered the way that you would expect someone to view your image. Like if you look at the inset image here, I don't think the little huts are going to attract the viewer's attention immediately. With that overly bright sky, there's quite a few distracting elements, but with linear filters here, I'm guiding people away from the overly dark sky and the bright foreground, and moving people up to the huts in that middle distance to become the hero elements of this black and white conversion. In the final part of this black and white, it's traditional that not all black and white photographs are completely black and white. There's a long history of black and white photographers putting some subtle tones into their image, whether it's sepia toning, blue toning, or split toning. That's where we assign one color to the shadows and usually a complementary color to the highlights. Now in the color grading panel inside of Lightroom, this does allow us to push some very subtle colors to change the mood of our black and white conversions. What you're looking at here is I've selected a blue tone for the shadows, and a slightly warm tone for the highlights. They're very subtle, but they're used, I think, to good effect here to create this cool, tranquil mood to this landscape I captured in Alaska. So again, this is using those split toning, assigning one color to the highlights. Here I'm assigning a cool blue tone to the water rather than the warm tone, and I'm choosing a warm tone, a red warm tone for those shadows in the background there, just to create a slightly different mood to these images. Now there are some controls after you've selected the colors and how much saturation you want to those colors. There are some controls over the blending. The blending adjusts the transition between the shadow, midtone and highlight colors. low blending values will typically create a stronger and more apparent separation between the two colors you've chosen, while higher values creates a more gradual transition between those colors. The balance slider shifts the color tone emphasis either towards the darker or lighter areas, so you're going to get more of the shadow color or more of the highlight color visible. So it's almost like the tipping point of a seesaw really, as to where you want more tones to have that highlight color that you've selected or the shadow color. Now, another interesting exercise when you're working with black and white is to go nearly black and white. You can see in this composition that there isn't a lot of color going on, and the way I've achieved this limited color palette is to lower the vibrance slider. I'm not going straight into a black and white conversion here. I've left the image actually in color, and I've grabbed the vibrance slider and pulled that a long way to the left, and then I've restored some of the saturation of the key colors. When we're lowering the vibrance, the saturated colors lose the saturation much more slowly than the subtle colors. The subtle colors will go monochrome very quickly, whereas the more vibrant colors hold their color a little bit longer. And we can actually restore the original saturation value just by raising the saturation to the right. So lowering vibrance to the left, then raising a little bit of saturation to the right. We could go into the color panel and then selectively target specific colors to lower the saturation or increase the saturation or luminance values of those tones. So you'll see some of these images that I had converted to black and white previously. They look quite good just with a subtle amount of color. So we're nearly monochrome, but I've left the dominant saturated colors here, the red warm tones, just a little bit vibrant here, so it's not completely black and white. So there's some great creative options available to you in Lightroom. So it's sort of a land that exists between full color and full black and white, if you like. And again, a little on your own exercise there is to choose images that you've already converted to black and white, and then try creating different versions, if you like. And that is possible inside of Lightroom now, as we can create different versions using different pairs of complementary colors, and maybe use the color wheel in the top left hand corner of this slide here to help you maybe choose different pairs of colors for the image that you're going to grade using the color grading tools there. So if you're looking at you're wanting to use the Discovery channel, you can follow specific photographers. Once you get an idea that you like their maybe black and white conversions or their edits, you can start following them. And I actually have my own link here, so you can go and look at some of the black and white conversions that I did in helping prepare for some of the Lightroom resources that they'll use in the Lightroom Academy for converting images to black and white. Okay, and in the slide deck I'm going to share with you, I'll also have a variety of gallery images that you can cycle through at your own speed. Just remember, you not only look at the before and after, but you can see all of the adjustment steps to the images that that you see in that Discovery channel. Okay, so there is the black and white special. Hopefully you've found something of use in this special. And again, if you have any questions in regard to the content, just put them in the forum below, and I'll try and get back to you as quickly as possible. Okay, see you next time.